back with the Hunt, Hike, Harvest Mountain Fitness Podcast. Hopefully everybody had an awesome holiday season. We took a little bit of a hiatus between Mike and myself. Back again, obviously, with me is Coach Mike Barnes. And we took a little bit of a break over the holidays, just kind of let everybody do their thing. And we kind of did our thing. We were just actually talking a little bit before this that both of us fortunate enough to get a hunt in over Christmas and the holidays, which is great. I don't know if we'll talk too much about that, but anytime we get to do that, it's always a good thing. And today we're gonna kind of tee one up, one that I think we've danced around, stuff that we've mentioned a little bit here and there, but we're gonna talk about the elephant in the room, especially when we talk about Western big game hunting. We're going to talk about altitude. We're going to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, the implications, what it's going to do for you, to you, and all those types of things. It's something that everybody talks about. And being that we are from where we are, you and I maybe are a little more acclimated than some, and we'll talk about those that maybe aren't. So, Mike, how are you today? And I'm excited to talk about this one. I don't know about you.
I'm doing great, Coach. I'm looking forward to talking about it as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting subject because you've got, I think, I wouldn't say schools of thought, but I think that you have different camps. You have people that recognize and acknowledge how critical the altitude factor is. And if you don't live in much altitude, you try to do everything you can to potentially train yourself up to be able to be more prepared for altitude. And then you have other guys that kind of go like, once I'm there for a couple of days, it is what it is. And, I just deal with it. Right. And so I think I want to kind of maybe start with that, maybe talk to both sides of that. Your kind of interpretation of, I guess, my interpretation of what I hear a lot of when the subject comes up.
Right. So if we're looking at both ends of the spectrum there, you've got folks that will come up and just, it is what it is. I'm going to deal with it as I go up. And I think that most people will take a look at their hunt and they'll have an idea where they want to be, what the trailhead is or what the camp is or what camps trailheads they want to be at. So, and then they'll say, okay, well, the top of the mountain, we're going to be on the northeast side, and I want to kind of hit that area, and here's some ridges I want to hit. And then all of a sudden you start to take a look at some of the mountains, specifically in the Rocky Mountains, and to get to 12.5 is really not that difficult, especially, Joel, you and I are elk hunters kind of by trade, but early season, you probably want to go high, and that's probably where you're going to have your best bet. So as you're kind of working over your maps, okay, well, you can do that. And if you just want to kind of, gamble and throw caution to the wind, or you can do a little homework and figure out that, okay, well, I need to be in as best shape as I can cardiovascular. I need to hydrate before, during, and after. I need to top off. I need to have my nutrition strategy worked out. I need to have where I'm going to sleep worked out. And what crossed my mind today, too, Joel, as I was kind of thinking about this, and there's a spot that I want to hunt, and hopefully I can get back into this area again next year, and it's about 12.5, and I'm thinking, man, I should just go right in there early season and bivvy up there and just, that's where I know they hang out, is towards the top of this mountain. I'm thinking, I don't know if I can pull that off. I mean, I live over near 7,000 feet. But
Right.
To go right to 12.5, I mean, as soon as I'm over 9.5, 10, I start feeling it. So hopefully, I guess what I'm trying to tell you is we'll hopefully have some good tips for the people that do want to prepare. And if you don't want to prepare, I hope you're one of those people that can just, you don't seem to be as effective. But, things can get a little sideways fast when you're
For sure
near maximal exertions for a long time and things along those lines. We'll get into all that though.
Yeah. Well, and I think, how's that saying go? If you're going to be dumb, you better be tough, or something like that.
Love that. That's one of my favorites.
If you're going to be dumb, I guess you better be tough. And there are, right? There's some people out there that are tough, and they may argue with you about whether or not they're smart or not. But at the end of the day, we know, especially from where we sit, right? Before we kind of get online, Mike and I usually kind of like brief a little bit of the subject matter. We talk a little bit about the things as far as topics and some of the bullet points that we want to hit. And one of the things that stood out to me is I'm kind of like compiling some of our data, some of our research, things that physiologically are what we consider to be like they're non-negotiables, right? Like your physiology is going to be affected the higher we get up in elevation, right? And the first one is, as I kind of was looking through this, and I mentioned this to you, is as we go up and we get above 8,000, we get to 9,000 and approach 10,000, VO2 max can be affected by as much as 3 to 5% negatively, right? Regardless of what kind of shape you're in. And shape is a relative term. We understand that. But at the end of the day, when I think about it, I say, well, guess what? If I am not very good cardiovascularly, and then I take a 3 to 5% decrement on top of that. Well, I've taken my plan or my foreseeable, right? Everybody loves e-scouting and all these things now. It's like I've taken my foreseeable kind of, circumference of where I plan to hunt, and now just shrink that down, because your ability to get to more country, right, is going to continue to shrink in. And as you add fatigue to those things and some other stuff, it's just going to really impact how much ground you can cover. It's going to impact how quickly you can get from one to the other. It's going to affect, so many things. So I kind of want to start with that. But let's talk about, I kind of have written down here some things that increase as we get to altitude. So I want to talk about red blood cells. I want to talk about hemoglobin, hematocrit, max O2 consumption, some of these things. Let's start with that, because without getting too sciencey, we need to understand that, like, what is really happening as we go up in altitude, and how is our body reacting to it. So those were kind of the first things that I wrote down was red blood cells, hemoglobin, hematocrit. You wanna tackle those right away, and maybe we start by telling people what the hell those are.
Sure. So basically, we're talking about the production of red blood cells as your body adapts to higher altitude. So if there's going to be less oxygen, your body compensates for that with a production of more red blood cells. And it's the carrying capacity within your blood itself to take that oxygen, drop it off, and then pick up a CO2 on the way out and drop that off. And there it goes round and round. So
Right.
a good thing for people that train and that people that have time and the benefit. So the moniker has been train high, sleep low. So your body
Right.
wants to go to altitude and, pick out your favorite elevation over 10,000 feet. And then you come down and you sleep low and you make an adaptation. So that's really, however, there's been some research to say that's not the case all the time. And it probably depends on the person's individuality.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, for us that live up high, it's great. But if you're at sea level and you don't have the benefit of training high often, or else even, living high like we do, you kind of got to get yourself in the best shape you possibly can is really the my thought.
Yeah.
I don't know, Joel, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I know when we look at that, so you talk about red blood cell production, we talk about the hematocrit piece, which is kind of like, the oxygen carrying components within blood, and how we have to adapt. And what most people don't understand is like that adaptation period is typically like it's a rough estimate, but I've heard, anywhere in research they talk 17 to 20 days a lot of times at altitude is about how long it takes for your body to adapt to being at specific altitudes, right? Meaning that for us to get higher red blood cell production and those things, like that's how long it's going to take. And most of us aren't hunting that long, outside of maybe, our born and raised guys and a few other lucky people that are out for an entire month, where the
Yeah.
tail end of that, they're actually starting to adapt. But most of us, we're out for a 5 day, a weekender, or if we're, 7 to 10 days, you're actually not going to ever achieve seeing that physiological adaptation. It's going to happen by the time you get home, but it's not going to happen while you're
Right.
there.
Yeah.
And so when I think about those types of things, and the previous statement, like 3 to 5% is my mind kind of wraps around this, like, well, is there a workaround to that, right? And to your point is, I would say, my objective should be cardiovascularly then to see, can I improve cardiovascularly by, let's say, 3 to 5% or even more, which then at that point, theoretically, it will potentially put me in a position where I will be able to attain or achieve the level of which is a little bit more commensurate with, where I was at when I left. Right. That's kind of my thought on that. Again, speaking hypothetically, from that regard, but I think about, like, if I were to be able to buffer it, and if I were to be able to kind of like counteract that, the more that I can do it wherever I'm at in terms of lower altitudes and those types of things and bump that up, it's going to have a lessening effect of how much I may feel, or sometimes have kind of that we call RPE, rate of perceived exertion, when I get there. And we're going to talk a little bit about that too. I've got a really cool guest, our chief science guy, who's, we're going to bring him on and talk a little bit about that, because he's got some really cool theories that we're going to discuss later on with that. So, but the other things that, I think about too with this is like, some of just like the day-to-day pieces, right? So the negative effects. Let's talk a little bit about side effects of altitude, because I think side effects of altitude are a real big one that most people don't necessarily think about, in terms of, just when we get back to camp and when we get from day 1 to day 2 and that type of stuff. So maybe hit on some of those. I've got a couple of them written down. Like, what are some like buyer bewares, if you will, that I think some get overlooked in your mind with altitude?
Well, with me, I'm hypersensitive to exercising at altitude to begin with. But when I have people that I hunt with, um, I'm just there's just so much going on physiological wise, but hydration is going to be absolutely critical. You're going to find yourself, there's going to be a fluid shift and you're going to be peeing a lot. And the higher altitude, a lot of times you're going to be in the sun. You're going to be pushing off water, either breathing it, um, or you're going to be, pulling off in sweat. And the funny thing is, if you've never been to the higher altitude, you might not even feel like you're
Yeah.
sweating that much because you're evaporating so quickly and the humidity is so low. But there's, so the rule of thumb is to replace the water that, you expire. However, you might not know how much you're expiring. So I've been on, excursions for less than 2 hours and I've dropped nearly 10 pounds. And it's like, okay, I got to put that back in. That was kind of a weird situation, but, drink as a, for instance, Joel, drink about as much as you possibly can. And there's strategies behind that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I like to, and if I'm out where I like to hunt, I'm going to probably put in 3, 4, or 5 miles, and I'll probably take in 100 ounces of liquid, um, by the time I'm back to the truck. And then I just
Right.
start pounding even more. So a quick and dirty is kind of watch the color of your urine. You want to have it come out
Yeah.
the light, and it shouldn't have any odor to it or very little. So that's kind of a nice little field test to start with. Some
Yeah.
of the side effects: fluid shift, shortness of breath, a decrease in speed or the rate that you're working. How fast you're covering terrain. Gosh, Joel, what else? There's just a ton that
Yeah.
kind of goes
No,
into it. I mean, I don't know if there's any like physiological markers that that aren't affected. To tell you the truth.
yeah. Well, and to kind of continue on that point with hydration, right, is, as you mentioned, I think one of them is that people don't recognize how much they're expelling, right? Like you said, you're actually at altitude, what you're actually breathing and exchanging of oxygen and gases is higher. So you're actually expelling more water, while you're huffing and
Increased
puffing up and out,
respiration.
increased respiration due to heart rate and everything
Right
else,
on.
right?
Yeah.
And then at the same time, yeah, you don't, a lot of times don't recognize, like, well, it's 30 degrees and I don't feel like I'm sweating. And you're really, I mean, you're shedding water like crazy, right? And so with that also is, you look at other things such as what goes along with that. Well, sodium is also going along with that. We
Good
work
point.
with, a great company with Protect, where there's a lot of them out there. But at the end of the day, the amount of sodium that you're putting off through perspiration and things like that, like if we don't replenish that, sodium and potassium being kind of like the two big ones, um, those are so critical in muscle function. And people don't realize that if we're not putting that back in, if muscle function starts going down, well, guess what? Then fatigue is going to increase, cramping, all these other things that go along with it. And we know that as much as like a 3% decrease in hydration, three seems to be a pretty popular number in our talk so far, is that muscle function is going to also go down. So it doesn't take long, if we're not hydrated, for everything else to kind of start having this cascading effect, right? And so I'm really big on that. There are we can give you some show notes here. We'll talk a little bit about hydration and some recommendations of how we can combat that, which I think is really critical. Some of the other things is, as if you're coming from lower altitude and heading up to the high country, sleep is going to be disrupted. Altitude affects our sleep quality, right? So we do some things on that side of the fence. We're going to have a discussion. I don't want to dive too far off in one direction. We're going to talk about some of these things in some nutrition talks coming up, but there's some things that we do to improve sleep quality up at altitude, because it is going to be affected. If we get dehydrated, we see higher instances of things like headaches, nausea. Immune function is actually going to be depressed a little bit up at altitude. So you can see like how quickly, right? And we did a series with Alex Hars, who summited Everest. And we had a 3-part series where we talked to him about training. We talked to him a little about nutrition. We talked to him about the trek itself. And there's a reason why they go up and come down and go up and come down and go up and come down and go up and come down. And we're talking extreme altitude, right? But that's, his was a 52-day trek just to get his body to acclimate enough to keep like kind of, crisscrossing his way all the way to get up to the top of that. And there's so many things that if we don't do a very good job with this stuff in terms of hydration, right, in terms of our training, right, and getting ourselves up to a level where we can continue to produce and put out and maintain quality of muscle function and some of those things, like it can really start to deplete or deteriorate what a hunt looks like day 2, day 3, and especially, beyond that for sure.
I think that the headache and the sleep thing is a really critical aspect of it, and it's a side
Yeah.
effect that you don't really kind of anticipate because you're so excited.
Yeah.
So you head off from base camp or wherever you're going. The next thing you know, you're like, well, I'm an hour and a half, 2 hours into it. And all of a sudden, not me per se, but some of the guys that I've hunted with from sea level, it's like, I got a little headache going. And I'm thinking, oh man, here we go. So
Yeah.
you start pushing the water, and then the sleep deprivation, it's night one for sure. Night
Yeah.
two, it's still interrupted. And what I've seen by night three is that they're so gassed out, they're going to sleep.
Right.
Is
Yeah.
that kind of your observation too? It seems like, okay, the
Yeah.
third night, you're probably going to just be wrecked.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think as you kind of settle into it, you've got a combination day 1, day 2 of like anticipation, excitement, and those things that also play into, sleep quality. And then after you get out and put in some miles and put in some work, like usually you get a little bit further down the road and your sleep will change or will improve just a little bit. But, I think if we really dig into the weeds on sleep too, is we do a lot of tracking with our cardio mood. These guys partner with the biggest sleep research company in the world, so their sleep data is tremendous, right? And the
nice.
thing that I monitor on a daily basis is not that did I sleep and how much, but what was the actual quality of that sleep, right? Like how much REM
Yeah.
sleep did I actually get, right? And how many disruptions do I have throughout the course of a night? And, I believe that the numbers, like your goal should be to have somewhere in the neighborhood of whatever your total bulk of sleep is for that any given night, is that you want REM sleep to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 30% of that. And,
Oh, okay.
and so if you get, if you're waking up in the morning and if you're tracking or anything like that, and you look at it and you say, wow, I got like 9% of REM sleep. Well, you might have slept at a reasonable amount, but the quality of it wasn't very good, which means that your
Yeah.
fatigue, your cognitive, awareness, and those types of things are all going to be also negatively affected. So that's a tough one. And I think that unless you are doing some kind of like a little bit preemptive work on how those things are operating prior to that, a lot of people I think probably don't recognize it as much as you think unless you're doing that beforehand, right?
You know what's funny though too, Joel, is that when you take someone to elevation, they're going to have, depending on how high they're going to get, you're going to probably be about 20% less oxygen. So you
Yeah.
end up gasping, and someone will be dozing off, and all of a sudden they're and heck, if you're in the same tent or even close, that person is, they want to get some oxygen in their system. And so on the other end during the day, so if you want to hunt, I don't know, whatever, from dawn to 10, 11, 12 o'clock, maybe all of a sudden you're like, I got to get a little sleep, man. I'm going to find a little spot in the sun over here, or maybe in the shade or whatever it
Yeah.
is. And you can doze off. I mean, I've dozed off for probably up to an hour. I'm just ruined. So,
Yeah,
like, look, I'm
for
going to get
sure.
to sleep when I kind of can because you're at elevation, I guess, is when I'm kind of connecting the dots the long way around.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. I think the other one that we didn't touch on is appetite. Altitude is going to suppress your appetite, and you hear people a lot of
Yeah.
times, and I've been with guys and hunting, and they're like, I'm just, I don't know, I'm not that hungry, right? And you see them kind of snack and things like that, and never really eat any quality fuel. And again, kind of going back to the Everest piece, I remember talking with Alex when we were talking about his trek, and he was saying how the higher that he got in elevation, it became the suppression of appetite became so bad that he would have to set a clock and almost like, I have to eat at this
That's a
point
good point.
because I
Yeah.
can't. I know how much I'm actually expending, and he's like, it was down to where it really didn't matter. He's like, taste and all this other stuff. Like, he's just like, I had to just go through the exercise of like chewing and getting food in the system because his
Yeah.
appetite completely ran out. So when you think about people that obviously we're not in that extreme of kind of situation, but if you come from somewhere down near sea level, 1,000 to 2,000 feet, and you move up 8,000 to 9,000 feet, odds are you might experience some of that stuff too. And you almost, I've seen people kind of set alarms, set schedules. Hey, we need to stop here, or just be present, right? That's kind of one of the things that I have, which is what that I wrote down in terms of some of the strategies. You have to plan. You need to be present while you're out in the field and not get so tunnel visioned on like, we need to get to that ridge, or did you hear that, or like, let's do a set of calling over here, and this is where we want to get to today. And then all of a sudden, like you said, I'm 3, 4, 5 miles, I'm an hour and a half, I'm 2 hours, and I haven't drank any water. I probably haven't stopped to make sure that I try and actually consume some calories, because we know that the expenditure of calories, which I think we'll talk about next, is off the charts depending upon how hard we're working.
Yeah. I was going to add to that too. It's so if you're with people that come from sea level or near sea level, they're not used to drinking as much water as we do. And if you live in some of the higher elevations, of course we do, Joel, there's a water bottle, there's, a full on Yeti 3264. I've got my water right here as well. Um, you, the guy that I was with, one of the guys that I was hunting with came from sea level, and he's like, man, I am just pounding water. And I was noticing how much, because, we had bottles and empties or whatever. I literally drank twice as much as he did. And I was telling him, I was like, dude, you gotta up it, man. You are not even close. But if you live at, 400 feet and you're thinking that you're pounding a lot of water, I mean, our rule of thumb is, and I know you do this probably too, Joel, it's like you should probably make your goal up here in Colorado, and if you're an exerciser, is about a gallon a day. And
Yep.
okay, so get the first half gallon by lunch and the second half gallon for the second half of the day.
Yeah.
And if you're, especially when you're, rocking and rolling in the mountains, it's like that's just a minimum. And you might
Yeah.
even find yourself still thirsty. But it's the
Right.
habit,
Yeah.
I guess, that we've developed as opposed to folks that are coming from lower elevations.
Yeah. I mean, I think back, and I know like we've touched on this in a couple of previous podcasts where I talked about like our death hunt or our death hike. Right. And in day one, which ended up being an 18-hour day, and we covered 26 miles or whatever, we stopped and filtered
Wow.
water almost every single time we passed water to make sure that we had enough, right? That we were never going to get low on water. And I was keeping track of how much water that I consumed in that day, and I took in almost 9 liters of water in that 18-hour day.
And that you think you were balanced though between what you were
No,
expiring and what you were taking in?
no.
You
By the
weren't
time
keeping up. Oh
No,
gosh.
by the time I got to camp, I was number one. I was exhausted, right? And number two, we had expended so much energy. I actually had run out of water about an hour to an hour and a half before we actually got
Ooh,
to what was our campsite location, and we were bushwhacking in the dark.
not good.
And so it was funny because my buddy Gabe, who owns Ivory Holsters, best holsters in the business if you're looking. Shameless plug for him. But Gabe comes over because I'm rummaging through my bag to try and get my tent set up and like food and all this other stuff. And he comes over and he's like, bro, he's like, here. And he had went, and we were at a high alpine lake, and he'd went and filled his bladder up and brought it to me. He's like, drink. He's like, you need to drink water. And I kind of like stop and look and hadn't realized some of that, like, not quite nausea, but a little bit just loopy
Yeah.
and whatever. And my bag looked like a garage sale. I had shit everywhere. And I just like my cognitive function had started declining. And I drank almost his whole bladder in a matter of like 3 minutes, and
You know
then
what?
got some food in me. And so it's like, that was a really good, it was good for me to, kind of like test myself to that level and get to
Yeah.
that kind of point of exhaustion where like I really was nearing a point where I was like, this could be bad. And, to have
There's
someone who recognized it and was like, dude, you need to get on it.
Yeah, 100%. There's two things that come to mind is that you're feeling good and I've been by myself and you're out scouting or hunting hard and then all of a sudden things you start doing stupid things. I mean, I don't want to embarrass myself, but I was like, what am I doing? This doesn't make any sense at all. And
Yeah.
you're like, something's not going too well for me right now. I need to like literally stop. And you'll stop for 10, 15 minutes or more and just like to collect yourself, drink some water. And the other things that I wanted to mention to you too, Joel, I just picked up one of those filtrations, those Grail bottles where you scoop
Yeah.
the water out and then press down.
Yeah.
That thing is freaking awesome. I every
Yeah.
so get your strategy. If you're gonna like, okay, I need to make it to this water source, fill your water, fill all your bladders, drink what's in your canister, and then fill it again. So now you're super topped off and you're hydrated when you're at that water
Yeah.
source because you don't know with a high degree of certainty when you're going to be back for water again. And
Yeah.
you also might have to worry about the people that are with you too. So when you
Yeah.
come to those water sources, pay particular attention to
Yeah.
topping yourself off, your bottles, your bladder, and yourself personally. It would be my
Yeah.
recommendation.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And just, I think it kind of falls back in line with what I mentioned before, which is just planning. And even if you're going out and you're going to, we're doing a base camp hunt, right? And it's like, well, yeah, we come back to camp. That's, we're going to go out and we're going to hunt this area, and we're always going to come back to, our drop camp and that type of stuff. Even in those situations, and I've done tons and tons of those hunts. I love hunting that way. It's great. It's nice and comfy at night to get back and have
Yeah.
all the, all the nice, comforts and those types of things. But even in those situations, I always have a filtration system on me because you
Smart.
never know, right? Where it's like,
Yeah.
it could be, hey, what happens if we get an animal down right at sundown? Well, your day just got a hell of a lot longer and you might run out of
Yep.
water, right? And so I think you
Yeah.
have to make sure that you're thinking ahead, right? And that you're always thinking about ways with which you can account for that type of stuff because well, last year, just to give you a similar context to that, Jason and I went into an area that Mike actually sent us, and he's like, hey, go in here, I've seen elk in here. I won't say where it's at, and Jason and I have never set one boot in that place. And we did the ultimate sin, which was Mike said, well, if you come back up, try not to go back up in this way. And we kind of looked and we're like, well, I don't want to go back where we came from. Let's explore over this way. And as we started getting back up into some of that stuff, and Mike knows, yeah, that tells you everything you need to know right there.
Yeah.
It got
It's
it got hairy and it was gnarly, and we both ran out of water. And we ended up finding a spring in between two rocks that was just dribbling water. And
wow.
I'm telling you what, if we wouldn't have had filtration right there, we still had an hour to probably get out of there, and we'd probably both been out of water for at least 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And that saved our bacon so bad, so much in that situation where I'm like, man, if I wouldn't have brought that, we would have been in deep trouble. Like it could have got
So
worse.
when we go offline, I'd like to talk to you more about that because the way you guys went up was extremely difficult. I've never done it. I've explored up some,
Stupid.
maybe halfway. I've
Yeah.
always wanted to kind of dabble in over that area, but I just don't have the
No,
guts. I was like, you know what? That scares me.
no,
And if
it
you
was
guys were
gnarly.
going hard, yeah, yeah. And so what I do too is I'll carry about 5 gallons of water in my truck in one of those military containers all fall long. I just keep it
Yeah.
in there because I know that there's going to be a time where I'm going to have to tap into this thing,
Yep.
and for whatever reason, so either you put an animal down or else you want to get back to the truck and like I got to top myself off because I got a 2 hour drive home or whatever it is, or I got to get
Yeah.
back to the tent. So I do like to carry that extra water there.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk about some of the stuff in terms of, kind of moving into uh, other implications, right? One of the things that I had written down here is we know that a lot of times when we're up and we're really trying to push it, we're trying to get to the next ridge, and we start seeing things like fatigue and lactate accumulation and some of these things, right? Lactic acid toleration at altitude also is a factor, and so guess what? That's going to be even more of a challenge. And as most of you know, when we get to those points, right, the crappiest, hardest, and sometimes most challenging type of training to do is training in that environment, right? And so if we do not have good buffering capacities, i.e., being in a little bit better cardiovascular shape, having a little bit more, if you've watched our conditioning episode that we did with Mike and JC, who runs our lab here, we talked about kind of that like base building and zone 2 work and some of those things. Talk in your kind of estimations, like how much of a factor some of that is max O2 consumption, lactic acid threshold, and some of that stuff, as far as like the guy who's still I'll just, throw caution to the wind, or the guy who's like, how can I combat this the best?
Well, from a practical point of view, I think there's a couple considerations. If you like to hunt by yourself, and I do often, I typically don't like to go that hard where you're up near that threshold. However, there'll be times when you're going to push it. And now that's when I hunt by myself. I like to cruise. I like to call in front of me. Even when I scout, I'm calling. I'm, taking my time and cruising along, and I'm using my Onyx to put down waypoints or whatever. But when you're with a group or someone else, what happens is the guy that's in back is back there for a reason because he's trying to keep up with the people in front. And
Yep.
if you're in back, you don't want to feel like, well, I'm holding everybody back. So the person in back could be at whatever, an RPE of 10, 9, 10. And the people out front could be at an RPE of just, whatever, 6 or a 7.
Right.
So, right. And the people that are at 6 or a 7 are like, well, why are we stopping? And the person in back is like, dude, I'm blowing up back here. So there's a couple of different considerations there. And I've been in that situation before. So to make sure that you're conditioned to put on those efforts intermittently when you're scouting or hunting or whatever it is, I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, if people tuned into our training, our metabolic training
Yeah.
and conditioning episode, we got into that kind of deep.
Yeah.
I would say if you're just err on the side of caution because it's going to hit you pretty hard. And I've been with people up there and we're, cruising along, not very fast. They're like, why am I breathing so hard? I just can't believe how much I'm breathing. I was like, bro, you got to slow down. There's no oxygen up here is the reason why you're in I was with a competitive mountain biker and he's like, why am I just breathing so hard? I was like, buddy, you got to slow down. You're not used to 9,000 feet and you've been on the gas for the last hour and a half. So I
Yeah.
slow down. I take my time. I eat. I drink. I make it enjoyable. I mean, I'll come up with an excuse. Hey, let me stretch my hamstrings or quads and just, find a rock to sit down on or a log or, just to slow the hunt down. So buffering capacity, absolutely critical. The other thing is I wear a heart rate monitor many times. I got one on right now. And I'm also looking for a recovery heart rate. So I know that if I'm going to go ahead and put together maybe a 2 or 3 minute effort, which is about that lactate zone effort, and I see my heart rate up going, okay, well, it's creeping up there pretty good. And your heart rate's affected. Of course, at altitude, it's going to be higher. Then you come back down. Look, I don't want to leave until my heart rate's at least below 100 personally. So that's how I like to kind of manage it in the field.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a big one. And we've kind of touched on that a couple times now. If you don't use something that's tracking it, it's hard for you to understand where you're at. And if you utilize something like a CardioMood, a Garmin, whatever, Polar, any of those are perfectly fine. We've went through and we've kind of vetted and tested a ton of these in our facility, which is why we go with this CardioMood. It's the best we found outside of wearing an actual chest strap in terms of accuracy and those types of things, and it's the
Nice.
closest we've come to a Polar, which is our Polar chest strap. That's just kind of I would say most people are pretty familiar with them as far as a company goes, and I find that what it's done for me is it gives me a really good idea of what my just daily operational capacities and faculties actually look like. And
Yep.
I've come to find out that through that kind of, self learning process is as I now move from here up into the high country and we go, on whatever, scouting, hunting, blah, 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 is I've learned like where my operational level is based on my own kind of perceived exertion level. And I can tell when, as you said, like I'm cooking it way too much, right? And I need to back off of it because I know, again, all the things that we've talked about in terms of energy expenditure and heart rate and how much I'm going to start expelling and perspiring and how it's going to affect hydration and muscle function, right? Like this thing is just this huge cascading effect of things that are all interlinked to each other that ultimately at the end of the day, I know if I overcook this thing and I just, be like, screw it, let's just go. And we're 36 hours into a hunt, it's going to bite me in the butt the
Yeah.
next day and the next day and the next day. And so, if you, I really encourage you, if you want to really learn more about that, go back. I'll provide the link up here to our podcast that we did previously talking about the metabolic components of this stuff, because it is absolutely critical to understand it. And the better you understand it, as well as the better you understand yourself in terms of how you operate and what level you're operating at, it is so huge to improving your efficiency, right? And I try to tell people that, kind of like staying like this throughout the whole, day by day in a hunt is going to make your experience that much better. And we're going to talk a little bit more in a future podcast kind of about the RPE thing and understanding how it actually, there's some qualifiers in like how they correlate to what your VO2 max actually is, and some interesting stuff on that in terms of what your perceived exertion looks like and what your overall ability to continue based on what that perception actually looks like, in a future conversation, which is some fascinating stuff. And I'm really looking forward to it. You're going to have to stay tuned. I'm not going to let the cat out of the bag too much with that. But I have an interesting one I want to throw in your court. And I already know the answer to this, but I'm going to say it anyway, because you see people that are like, okay, I don't live up here. I'm going to try and find a hack for this. This is my way around it. Let's talk about some of the most absurd things that you see in training for people that are like, this is how I account for training at altitude. Go.
Wow. The face mask one is the restrictive breather. It looked
It's
kind
the
of cool
first thing
because
I have written down right there.
yeah, yeah. It's fun though too. So they'll get on one of those step mills and they put a backpack on, and then the breathing restriction device, and you're thinking that person must really know what they're doing because they're working. And it's my understanding that there is little to no benefit. You're probably just
You
compromising
don't
your
have
own
to dance
workout.
around it. Just let's go right at it, Mike. Let's go right at it. They're horse shit. They don't work. Folks,
Yeah,
stop
yeah,
wearing these masks. It has
yeah.
scientifically been proven they do not work. Not only do they not work, they actually deplete your ability to inhale and exhale, and there is nothing that says they're going to make your lungs stronger. It actually does the opposite. Like, they are the most absurd thing. And when Marshawn Lynch and a couple other football donkeys threw them on, everybody thought, oh, pro athletes are using them. And it's like, no, pro athletes
Yeah.
got paid to use them.
Well, and that's part of it too. So if you think you've got a hack that's going to um, make it better, and you haven't done your homework and you don't know where to look for evidence-based information, you might just look, dude, 2-3 times a week when you put that thing on, you're getting a worse workout than you could
Yeah.
be. You haven't gone as long, you haven't gone as hard, and you're not making the adaptations of not using it altogether. So that would definitely probably be the number one. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
No,
It's
it's so funny because I'm like, how can I try to get to this, and literally the first thing out of your mouth, well, training mass, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have two
yeah.
like asterisks outside of the two words training mass in there.
There's
So
part of me though that almost there's part of me that almost wish it did work because it looks so badass. And then
right,
it was
yeah,
like, oh God, I
well,
just can't do it.
yeah,
I just keep
I mean,
throwing there.
I guess in theory, and again, this is like, as you go into research and you go into the development and advancement of things, training, technology, all the stuff that we try to do to keep kind of expanding, right, our horizons as well as our methodologies, is I have no problem with the concept or the idea or going through even making a product like that and saying, I wonder if this will work. And
Right.
they did that, and unfortunately they either put tremendous marketing in place to sell it, which they did, right, without the research, or
Yeah,
they did the research and said, well, let's just do it anyway because people are dumb and they'll buy it, right? It's the 3
they did.
a.m. QVC garbage that sells millions upon millions on gimmicky things. And so I don't hate on the fact that the concept and the idea has good intentions, but the delivery and actual take home in terms of what we now know after vetting it and researching it and saying like, okay, does this thing actually work? The answer is no, it doesn't, right? There's only one instance that I can, and again, I think if you look at a lot of things within training, and a lot of people are so quick. I saw a guy uh, on YouTube who his whole premise is he tells everybody he's an exercise physiologist at some small school up in New York. And all he does is go and look at everybody's stuff and bashes why they're wrong and how that's not true. And he's fact checking them and all this other stuff. And I'm like, bro, if you just want to, like, crush everybody, that's perfectly fine. But I'm like, this is your whole platform, is to try and make yourself sound smarter while he's in a tank top and looks like he's, done 10,000 curls in the last 2 weeks. And
I
but
think I
at
might
the end
know
of the
that guy.
day, yeah. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Gino, is that his name? Anthony? Tony?
I can't remember. He has a name, something like that. Yes. Um,
Got it.
but realistically, as I think about it, it's just one of those things where if we can prove and if we can test and if we can validate some of these things, yeah, sure, maybe there is a product that will account for that, right? Outside of having a deprivation chamber or something like that, which if you've got an extra, 100 grand laying around, then more power to you, right? And they're
You
out
know,
there.
between you and I, we know a lot of people. Do you know anybody that has a hyperbaric chamber or altitude chamber?
I did. I did, and I don't now. Our previous facility that we were actually in used to have one, and I know that there are some fighters that utilize them. And the point that I was going to get to, what I was going to say is the only contextual place that those masks are, in my mind, possibly useful is in an MMA setting. And I've seen guys that use them in an MMA setting where they talk about if you're in, say, like a gi type tournament or something like that, where guys actually get asphyxiated
Ooh,
in jujitsu and things like that because the gi is, in their face, and they
yeah.
get to that. And I've
There's
actually
some
seen guys.
chokeholds, isn't there, in that
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well? Isn't there
Oh,
some
yeah,
chokes
yeah.
with
Where
the gi?
they're
Yeah, I've
actually
probably seen some.
using the gi to do
Yeah,
chokes and things like that. But I've actually talked to guys that train and work in mixed martial arts, as far as saying, like, we use those because it teaches guys to run and operate in a restricted type environment, that they may have to in, say a jujitsu
right.
tournament or something like that, a gi based jujitsu tournament. So that's the only place where, again, like, I always think it's really easy, and I kind of offshot that by talking about the other guy, because I think it's really easy when people look at things and go, well, that's just complete garbage. And then they bash it on Instagram to try and make themselves look better, which is where I was kind of headed with that. And the reality of it is you have to understand that if you don't understand the application, the integration, and some of those things, right? Where if I went
Right.
into a place like that and I saw someone wearing one of those altitude masks, which is not an altitude mask, it's just an asphyxiation mask, I would say, oh, well, I know why they're using that, when most people would be like, thought that's the stupidest thing. We know those don't work. And I'm like, yeah,
Right.
but in that case, it could be useful. In the case we're
But
talking about, not useful.
no, but I think that in the case that you're talking about with the fighters, is that, look, I want them to experience being somewhat restricted.
Yeah.
It's not for a
Yes.
physiological adaptation. I
No.
just want to make sure you've been
Yes.
there
Yeah.
before.
And
Right on.
that's the whole thing. We have to understand the why factor, right? Which is the biggest part of that. We have to understand why they're
Yeah.
actually doing that. It has nothing to do with trying to initiate a training response. It's trying to initiate an environmental constraint of
Right.
what they need to get, we'll say, accustomed to, or get a little bit more used to, which is potentially being a little bit suffocated almost
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
a you know a martial arts event or tournament or
Right on.
something of that nature. So anyway, all right. What so that was one, the training mask. Um any others that you can think of, stuff that guys
You,
just think, to me, I'll throw this one out there. I think guys and girls believe that just high intensity work until you're blue in the face is how you can overcome any type of deprivation based on altitude or whatever. And I think people
it,
really overcook it.
You know what? I think that because it's so uncomfortable, they just get more comfortable being uncomfortable. We've heard that little saying,
For
but it
sure.
might be just their tolerance for high intensity efforts as opposed to optimal fitness and optimal adaptation and training. So they all just go ahead and blast away on interval training. You know what? Of course, there's a place for it, but it needs to be integrated with a lot of different factors, and
Yeah.
which we've been talking about here as well. What about? Did you want to add anything that? And then I'm going to hit you up with another one.
No, go ahead.
What about? I'm seeing some evidence for beet juice
Oh, heck yeah.
improving cardiovascular function. I haven't seen anything on altitude. I
Yep.
think that it's somewhat early to have any determination of how effective beet juice is, but there's some evidence that would suggest. I don't think we can conclude at this point, but I won't completely walk away from beet juice. Yeah, what do you got?
I'm I'm all in on beet juice.
Are you
Beet
all okay? Okay,
100%. I have been for probably 5 or 6 years. And even to the extent where, like, my pro guys that I work with, it is part of our game day prep. I try and get them to utilize it days before.
nice.
What we know and what we've seen in terms of some of the research is that because of the high nitric oxide component in beets and beetroot and any derivatives of whatever else you can squeeze out of a beet, we see that it does have a positive correlator to improving cardiac output, right? So you're going to get more vasodilation. If
Yep.
you're using them routinely, I believe, don't quote me on this, I'll try and see if I can find it, that it actually does help improve as some type of correlator or synergistic effect on red blood cells. And so I'm huge on it, and I try to always bring some. Like when we go on our hunts, I've gotten now to where I'm actually working and utilizing some stuff that is more in a gummy format, and I'm talking about just regular kind of your gummy bear type stuff. I'm not
Yeah.
talking about the CBD stuff or any of that, but it is
Right.
a gummy that has beetroot extract in it. And we do that on a daily basis when we're doing our hunts. And so, yeah, I've been sold on beetroot for quite a while, and yeah, I would never tell anybody not to. And again, one of the things is we're going to have some upcoming podcasts. We're going to talk about some supplementation and things like that. Is if you know me and you know anything about like stuff that I utilize, I'm not going to shove things that are chemistry projects down my throat that are, claiming they're going to give me this much in energy and muscle mass and blah, 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 this other stuff.
Yeah.
I have done dietary and supplemental research at, university tested levels and things like that previously in my career. And, for me, I'm going to put things into my body in terms of fueling and hydration or whatever. They're going to come from natural sources, food sources, and things that aren't going to potentially have adverse side effects like Whole Foods. I know I'm
Right.
talking.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
Yep. No, that's great.
um,
I'm glad you got me up to speed on that one. I'm going to do a little more research because I've seen some stuff
yeah,
from preliminary, which has been a number of years ago.
yeah,
But yeah, for
yeah.
whatever reason, I just haven't really looked into it that far.
Yeah, big fan.
Nice.
So,
Love it.
what else you have, Mike?
Geez, I guess one of the things I wanted to point to a couple things is that when you're moving to altitude or, you're going to come up to altitude to hunt, you don't know how you're going to respond. And everyone has an
Right.
individual response to it. And I've seen some people just, walk through or blow through 7, 8, 9, 10,000 feet like it didn't exist. And I've
Yeah.
seen other people kind of like, oh, dude, you're at 4,500 and they've never been to altitude. So, they have this huge fluid shift. They're peeing all the time. They can't breathe, the sleep, all the side effects,
Yeah.
negative side effects in particular. So just kind of keep that in mind. And I think that it would probably serve um, people to start out at a lower elevation and see how they respond, as opposed to,
Yeah.
I want to go to the highest peak I possibly can. It's early season, and I got a good feeling that's where we're going to find the elk. And it's like, well, that could be true, but you do
Yeah.
have to manage the situation. So would you, your individualization is a fundamental principle of exercise that Joel and I
Yeah.
deal with all the time. It applies it as you go into altitude as well. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Joel.
Yeah, I think that some of the things that I think about, and you and I talked about this offline prior to, which is I myself personally am kind of have a little bit of a rate limiting part in my own physiology, which is I've been up to altitude countless times. I've done a 14er or two or whatever. And I know for myself personally, number one, I've gotten altitude sickness multiple times. The first time I got it, it was almost, I was actually skiing. And every time that I would get to the
Mm,
top of the mountain, I would get nauseous. I would get dizzy. I would just get miserable, right? Ended up tromboning lunch a little bit later on and just got sick. I got ill. And I noticed that in about 2 or 3 of those trips, every time I would get to the top, I got worse. Every time I got back down, I'd get better. Worse, better, worse, better, right? And so that was my first experience. And then I had another one climbing a 14er here in Colorado, 14,000 foot peak here in Colorado. If you're not familiar with that, it's a huge thing. I think there's 50 some of them here in Colorado. And what I've found is that regardless of how good a job I do in terms of trying to stay hydrated and trying to eat and trying to replenish and all these other things, 13,000 for me and above is no good. I
yeah,
am not very equipped. My own just physiology and makeup, again, kind of going back to a discussion that I mentioned about our Everest podcast. If you've never watched that, I highly recommend it. I'll provide you a link for that as well in here. Alex talked about the fact that there are people that no matter how hard they train, no matter what kind of conditioning you get into or whatever else, there are people that just flat out cannot handle being at specific altitudes, no matter regardless of what kind of condition they're in. And we discussed that a little bit, how they've had world-class athletes who, guess what? Best shape of their lives, go up, try
yeah,
and climb, a Kilimanjaro or a Denali or an Everest or something like that. And you go, oh, well, they should make it no problem, right? And they're like, guess what? Their
yeah.
physiology is not made up for them to handle altitudes of, specific amplitudes. And so that's something where I tell people, if you start to sense any of those things, it is really critical that you are honest with yourself and aware, and you say, all right, if I get to there and I don't feel very good, you need to either stop, retreat, or come back down a little bit. It's so important to be aware, right? And that's one of the things that I have kind of written down here is like, be present, right? It's so easy, I think, to get distracted while we're up in the high country, and we're trying to find that bull and we're trying to listen for everything. And did you hear this crash? And was that a cow call over there?
That's right.
And all these things, and really lose sight of stuff like, how am I actually feeling? Right. Oh, that's right. I forgot. I should make sure that I eat. Oh, how much water have I drank up to this point? Do we need to make sure that, the next stream we cross, we refill, whatever that looks like. And so being present to me is a huge one, and planning. We're going to talk more about the supplementation piece in a future one. We touch on a couple things today, but I want to really kind of open this up. We got a guest I'm going to bring on and talk a little bit about
Same.
that. So that's kind of where I would leave it. We'll leave you some other links to things today that speak to some of these things. I'll tell you that if you go to our website, Hunt Hike Harvest Outdoors, we have some really cool stuff up on our website that kind of gives some kind of illustrations of what happens as we go up in altitude. I'll plug some of those into here as well for you guys. But man, I love talking about this stuff. I think there's so much that we can do to combat stuff in our training and how we hydrate and how we kind of plan and prepare and that type of stuff. And I think our mission is to try and get people a little bit more in the know of, like, yes, you can do a lot to help yourself improve how you operate when you get out there, if you're really being honest and doing your due diligence.
Joel, I just wanted to add one last thing. And if you are up at altitude and things start to get a little sideways, where you're losing that cognitive function and you don't feel like you can handle it, or else someone that you're with looks like they're having problems, get down, get down.
Yeah,
You will
for
feel
sure.
incredibly better, and they will feel incredibly better. You skiing up and down is probably the best example I can think of. I feel like
Yeah.
crap at 13, and I feel great at 7 or 8 at
Yeah.
the bottom of the mountain. And I mean, it's incredibly predictable. And you can also, when you come out of the mountains and you're coming back home or whatever it is, you feel like Superman. It's absolutely
Yeah.
incredible. Like,
Yeah.
golly, I feel just amazing right now. So those adaptations are real.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I appreciate it as always, Mike. Thank you so much. We're gonna continue heading and blazing this trail, talking about a whole bunch of other stuff. Some of the upcoming episodes, again, I think like we're kind of like holding our cards close to the vest here, but we've got some good guests coming up. We've got some exciting stuff heading into the new year. I hope that you guys, if you haven't checked out any of our previous podcasts, be sure to go check them out, and we'll make sure that we continue trying to hit the mark with the stuff. Leave your comments. If you have questions, leave them. Check out the comment section as well and look at any of the links that we provide. Our mission is to try and provide back to you guys as much connectivity and linkage as possible. Head over to our website. We'd love it if you subscribe to our page, and we look forward to continue having these discussions and bringing some more people on board that I'm sure, which is a pretty low bar, are smarter than I am, to help us continue navigating these waters. So happy New Year, Mike. Appreciate it, brother. And we look forward to talking to you next time.
Thanks, Joel. Right on, buddy. Thanks for having me.
All right. See you guys.